Hello everyone, welcome. Sorry for interrupting. It's great to see so many of you in the room, and we've got like 30 people online as well. And yeah, it's great to see so many of you. Welcome back. Happy New Year. Right, okay, so yes, today it's my great pleasure to have Associate Professor Jean-Francois Mercure, who is also one of our assistant directors at the GSI, right? JF is so you're associate professor of climate policy, so you're in the economics, in the business school.
Finance and accounting.
In the finance and accounting division. And okay, so yes, so JF is in climate policy, and he's been back at Exeter with us for just coming on to a year now. Before that, he was at the World Bank for a couple of years, and before that, he was at Exeter in the geography department. And he's actually moved around a lot because at the very beginning, JF trained as a physicist. So Jeff is going to talk about his new book and also about a policy unit that he's setting up at the GSI. And I just wanted to say a shout out to students, especially early career researchers, but really anybody who's keen, who has energy, who has time, enthusiasm. If you're interested in what JF is going to talk about, then please come and talk to him afterwards, because we're looking for energy to carry this forward. So take it away.
Okay, thanks. Can everybody hear me? And do you know roughly if it's okay online, the sound?
Assuming it's
So
good.
if I move around, do they lose sound?
Unless you put on the power.
Actually, it should be okay because there are mics.
In the room, so it should be okay.
Okay, okay, fine. All right. Yeah, great to be giving the seminar. It's very, very happy. Great to see everyone. So yeah, it's kind of funny trajectory where I was in geography. Tim brought me in 2019, and then was 3 years geography, and then left for the World Bank, and then came back to the GSI. But then as I came back, I landed in a different department, which is the business school, finance and accounting, for various reasons. So it's interesting. So this is, I suppose, my career, a kind of lifelong quest for a climate policy that is effective and equitable and actually works and solves the problems. So that's what I'm talking about. In fact, this is a book that I'm publishing right now, submitting to Cambridge University Press with that title, co-written with colleague Hector Pollitt, who I've worked with 15 years on this same quest for a climate policy. We've done lots of work on economics, macroeconomics, jobs, and that's kind of the outcome. And it's actually maybe not what you expect. And it's a rethinking, because it's really going quite far away from the mainstream thinking about climate policy. So I'll try to describe that. And it goes a lot into issues of risk. But just before, as a kind of quick word about this. So since I came back in the summer, I've been sort of trying to get sort of different resources together to create this unit, which is not funded externally. It's internally co-funded with not much really, just an underwriting of one postdoc by the business school. But what this hopes to be, hope I can convince everyone that this could work, that this is worth doing, is an interface with policymakers for Exeter in the kind of economic space, because I know we've got access and different other initiatives looking at interfacing with policymakers more generally, or climate policymakers, that is. But I'm looking really at the economics of the transition and how we engage with policymakers. And I can say, have I got credentials to kind of claim that? I suppose if the work at the World Bank, working in Ministry of Finance, is the credentials, I suppose. But it's really systems thinking in the sense of the GSI and Tim's work and so on. And hopefully we succeed, but we do have work already with the Ministry of Finance in Brazil, and so we are doing that. So I guess it kickstarts us. There's a number of people involved, and hopefully we can grow that and bring in more funding and activity. It's open for anybody who wants to participate, because hopefully it has a good network that allows scientists and researchers to sort of engage with the policy world. But importantly is that it's co-creation with the policy worlds. It's not throwing knowledge at policymakers. It's really kind of working out what needs to be figured out with policymakers, and then finding the right tools and analytics to address that. What I was doing at the bank, I created this thing with a colleague called Etienne Espang, who came from the French Development Agency. It's this thing called the Coalition for Capacity on Climate Action. This is a World Bank program that sort of core-funded within the World Bank, is still going, obviously, that looks at creating bridges with ministers of finance in particular, but policymakers and economic related questions around climate change. And it's sort of demand and supply of knowledge really for Ministry of Finance. So what resources would they go for? So I think, for instance, let's say we go to Uganda, and they say, okay, we're very active in climate policy, but we need more support. It's not true actually, because they've got a good research group doing climate economics in the department in Uganda. But let's imagine they didn't, then we could help them kind of find the resources and the right people to sort of help develop that capability. Actually, I should say Uganda is very good at it, and we know them. So it's demand driven in the sense that it really starts from a conversation with the policymakers and then works with the policymakers to see what to do next. Via this, we are working with the Ministry of Finance in Brazil, but there's also work with Uganda, with ministries in Central Asia. We've got different places in Latin America. We work with the UN Economic Commission for Latin America, for instance. And a big topic is economic modeling, how to provide resources for economic modeling with to different ministries. Okay, so let me get started. So this is the book I've written already while I was in geography, and this is the one that's coming out hopefully this year, in which I'm talking about now. It brings together much of the, I suppose, expertise I've accumulated with Hector over the years on this, and it's written, importantly, written for the non-experts. And so we'll be able to eventually share that. Okay, so rethinking climate policy. So I'm going to make a really, really terrible caricature of what I think is often what people think about when they think of climate policy currently. So they think, okay, reducing emissions is expensive. Countries don't want to invest because it's expensive. There's defectors, but we need global agreements to get people to invest and to get involved. And importantly, we need a carbon price to induce different people to invest in low carbon. And if we have a carbon price high enough, things are going to work out, emissions are going to go down, and the economy is going to move on. So I'm going to challenge everything in there. I think all of that is such a bad narrative that it doesn't work. It never leads anywhere. And in fact, it kind of bogs us down into something that really is not, we're going to be trapped where we are for a long time with that. So instead, it's much more a question of, first, decarbonizing accelerates growth, it doesn't slow it down. That's the first debunking thing I would like to do. Second is, it's capital intensive, so necessarily it accelerates growth. So maybe talk a bit about that. Second, it creates financial risk. And third, carbon pricing doesn't do what you think it does. Right? Okay, so let's start with that. Okay, so first I'll talk about tipping points. It's work done with Tim on the EV transition. So I think that's illustrative of what's currently happening in technology, right? How did we get to that actually? Then winners and losers in the transition, that I think is the critical issue that we need to think about, right? And after that, what is the actual cost of the transition? It's not a sort of economic cost like a GDP cost. It's actually the risk of heading into instability and/or inflation, right? I think this is really crux of the matter. And then I'll give some reflections on this. Okay, so I suppose the most important diagram we could think of in climate economics would be this one. That's what would be my view. I'm sure not everybody agrees with this, but okay, so there's adopters of technology. At the beginning, there's not many, and eventually there's more, and eventually you run out of adopters because most people have adopted a technology, let's say, or a practice or a way of doing something. It could be an industry, it could be households. But typically, you know this, right? Moore's law for computers, like costs are coming down as more people get into this. And because costs are going down, more people get into this, right? So it's a two-way feedback. That's important because people buy electric cars, the costs come down, people buy electric cars. So eventually there's a chance electric cars become the new normal or cheaper than the normal, right? In fact, it's happening. That's our paper on the tipping point. But then if it does that across the board, then you think, oh, well, the new green economy, there's no reason why we think it should be more expensive. It might be in some places and less in other places, but importantly, it's not necessarily the case that a low carbon economy is more costly to operate than the brown one. And I think there's plenty of evidence for that. So I'll start from that. Okay, we've had a transition before in mobility, right? That's one. And back then, that's back in the early 1900s, 1920s, there was a massive revolution, economic revolution, really. I mean, I write a lot and I read a lot about industrial revolutions and how technology changes and causes this kind of revolution in the economy. Well, typically, this is what happened. There's data, the cost, that's the Ford Model T in the US. Costs were coming down. There's a kind of a profit margin that's kind of narrowing down as the volumes go up. And so essentially, initially, we may make a bit of money out of the profit margin, but later it's much more about the volume. The profit margin can decline a lot, but the volume is growing much faster than the profit margin is coming down. So there's a lot of money being made out of reducing costs and increasing volumes. I think that's almost always true in technological change. So there's no reason to think this is not happening, right? And indeed, that's the data we have. So that's good, a good time series we've accumulated actually over time with my colleague Eileen Lam, who was a PhD student with me and carries on now doing research at the World Bank. That we've got the cost of the batteries are coming down, and the volumes are going up. And because that's going to be the 7th submission of that paper, right? I think. Where some people are just not ready to kind of believe that there could be a tipping point in electric cars. I should say in the new version, we have also established where the cost saving is going. So some of it's going into bigger batteries, more performance, and some of it's going into making the car cheaper as well in absolute. So there's a kind of combination. So not just battery costs are coming down, the car price is actually coming down in the market, as well as performance increasing. Right, so there's a lot of graphs, sorry for the busy charts, but it's just look at the shape. So in blue are the internal combustion engine cars, like the petrol cars, diesel, and in blue are the electric and plug-in hybrids. You can see over time, that's a nice time series, right? You see in Europe, let's say this is the distribution of sales according to the price, right? The price is down here, so it goes from up to 150,000 for a car, right? In the USD. You see the histogram being squashed there, right? So it's changing rapidly. And in fact, you can see how electric vehicles are gradually filling the space. The more and more you've got an EV for every user, every potential customer, there's one they could buy. You need to match one car for each potential buyer, right? So some people have a family, some people need a truck, some people, you've got all sorts of requirements. So that's how it works. So what's happening there? So it's nothing to do with the carbon price. In fact, it's really to do with, in fact, the fuel duty is very high. It doesn't induce people to buy EVs. What's been happening is much more in terms of subsidies and mandates. So and actually the trend now is that we think that the tipping point is going to be in the next 5 years where they break cost parity, where price parity, where cost parity in the kind of life cycle and price parity arrives a bit later because And there's an issue in time where with a petrol vehicle, some of the money you pay is later because you pay for fuel, whereas the electric car, you pay more money up front and less later. This is Tim's work with Josh Buxton and Chris Bolton, looking at the increasing autocorrelation in the fluctuations in the time series to say that because it's been increasing, it's the early warning approach saying that it looks like the tipping point is there. And of course, I should probably let Tim.
Well, in China and the EU, but no evidence in the US though, which is interesting because you can see the sales don't nosedive in the same way in the US.
Yeah, I think the US kind of wavering, or
Yeah.
it's like we're wavering in endlessly wavering. There's a spelling out also geographical that's happening, and I think that's representative of how technology transitions have happened over history, where it starts in a core innovating country where there's a market and there's innovation and there's a lot of progress, and it spills out into the neighbors that gradually start to follow and adopt. So you can see there's a kind of thing happening here and it's spreading, and there's another one here spreading. So China is a big leader. US has been a big leader, but of course US is kind of wavering, and then the other ones, Northern Europe, I suppose. So I suppose Germany, Netherlands, UK, and Norway, which is where there's the highest proportion now of EVs. And as you can see, it's spilling out and it's gradually covering. You see, a lot of places have none, but it's really, you can see this. So you can see, look into the future where that's going. And I think it's telling us something. Similar thing happening with renewables. I'm sure everybody's aware of that. Like offshore wind is cheaper than coal. Solar energy is cheaper than coal. So why are we saying that the transition is expensive? The most important source of energy is cheaper than what used to be the cheapest, which was coal. So that's also an interesting history. Offshore wind, the whole history is to do with supportive policies that create certainty in the market so that investors could invest with minimized risk. And that induced really a kind of flood of capacity, like adding capacity in the offshore wind side. And then costs coming down really drastically in the UK and the North Sea. Same for solar energy, that's the feed-in tariff in Germany. Again, nothing to do with the carbon price, right? It's just giving certainty to investors that there would be income over the duration of the project. And the costs have come down dramatically. Like solar energy, depends where you start, how much you would say it's come down. But if you went back, like it would have been orders of magnitude above what it was initially in the 50s. And then it's come down a factor 10 to the 4, I think. And that's Femke's work, actually. Again, it's a similar story where which is the cheapest source of energy over time, and it seems solar energy is taking over the whole map. That's because the rate of cost reduction is so high that that's kind of what's happening. So then, even nuclear, coal, they don't compete. Okay, so that's I guess in a nutshell the sort of tipping point. The way to think about technology is to add capacity, costs come down, and then eventually the thing rolls down the hill on its own. You have to push for a little while, and eventually it begins to roll down. So it's not this story about paying more and more to be able to decarbonize more and more. It's just really not like that. So that's my first point. Okay, I'll move on to winners and losers. I think that's the crux of the matter. Why we see so much polarization around climate policy? Why it matters? Okay, so that's the model we use. Well, one can use any economic model really, but I think we've designed this over the last 15 years, I would say, to study that question, and it's used in consultancy, so it's used by policymakers sort of all the time. There's about 25, 30 economists working on this model. I should say it's maintained by the consultancy company Metrics, and I spent 20% of my time working with that consultancy. And it's not really consultancy, I would say it's more like a research facility for those in the natural sciences, where you go to telescope and you book time on the telescope and then publish papers out of what you've obtained from that facility, I think it's the same. So the telescope is, I'm going to show it, it's the economic model that you can book time on if you've got research funding and then work with the economists on an economic experiment, right? So we have a macro economic model. So that what that does is it looks at production, jobs, prices, exports, imports, productivity, and so on in an economy. Very highly disaggregated. So it's got 70, I think it's 71 regions now because it changes, it's been changing, and 43 industrial sectors, right? So that's the economy, like, it's a primary extraction, manufacturing, and services, but divided in 43, right? Some of them will be like oil and gas, some of them will be like, I don't know, textiles or chemicals, and then transport, and then you've got insurance, education, things like that. So economy is divided like that, but also the global economy divided in 71, so it covers the globe. And importantly, it's comprehensive for greenhouse gas emissions, so we can put that into climate models for fuel combustion and industrial processes, and then we need a land use model to complement for the missing land use stuff. Okay, I created this model some 14 years ago. The FTT model, that's a model of technological change. It's essentially the first slide I showed, which I think is the most important slide in economics. It's the diffusion curve with the learning curve. That's the model, right? It models that, calibrated on data, a lot of data. So all the data we're showing about electric vehicles, that's kind of calibrates this FTT transport model we've got here. And then it makes a forecast, a conditional forecast as to where we think the technology is going under assumptions of policy and market and demand and so on, right? So it's conditional to these things where we think the technology is going. So the economy demands a service, and these models provide the service back to the economy at a certain price, right? So it will influence economic outcomes, what happens. So if say power generation was going to be more expensive, it would have implications in industrial sectors within the economy, which would then feed back here with a change in demand for electricity, let's say. The same for transport. But interestingly, the most important feedback is that as we go to electric cars, we use less oil, and that then influences the economy quite drastically, enormous. Okay, then we've got natural resources, like a lot of data on oil and gas, and policies, greenhouse gas emissions, and then we have this climate model. Because I started this before joining Exeter, it's other folks, not our own climatologists, but Tim was involved in the Genie back. And we also have some financial analysis, which I'll show later. Okay, what if I was going to explain what is the capital intensive transition, the low carbon transition that is capital intensive? What do I mean with capital intensive? So renewables have essentially no operational costs. All the cost is upfront. If you compare that to gas electricity is not that expensive to install, but then costs the price of gas each year over time. It's a lot of money. So actually the gas is much more than the capital itself, the machine. So you defer, in a way, you defer to the future all the cost of electricity, right? Renewables, everything's upfront, so you have to spend, you have to get finance to finance a big installation upfront, and later it costs nothing. So all you do is pay back loans, essentially, with the income. The big difference is that all the construction happens up front, all the spending happens up front, rather than being deferred over time. So you're moving spending forwards. Because you're doing that, it's accelerating economic activity up front and decreasing it later. That's the fundamental process happening. But it's not just doing that, because it's changing, it's got ramifications across the economy, because of course, by eliminating gas plants, we are eliminating demand for gas. So a whole plant's worth of gas demand in the future, that can be a lot of money. That's a lot of work that's never going to be done by extraction workers in gas fields, right? So that's the way, or maybe gas fields never be built. In fact, maybe a lot of capital to extract gas that is never going to be manufactured, and a lot of jobs that are never going to materialize in fact because they're not needed. So if you looked at a value chain, let's say, here's a kind of pictures of the value chain. You've got, like, let's say, oil extraction. So I'll talk about electric vehicles and oil, right? So oil extraction, steel making, refining, manufacturing of different parts of cars, right? Fuel distribution, and then services, right? Maybe some kind of enjoyment of the outcome in some way. So what happens then, let's say it's the transition to electric cars really rapid with a tipping point where in just a space of 20 years, where conventional cars are disappearing, right? By 2030, we're not supposed to have them anymore. So that's, okay, so cars consume, well, vehicles, let's say road vehicles consume about, what, 60% of the output of oil, right? So if that changes quickly, that's 60%, it's a big part of the whole and big industry, right? So it's absolutely enormous. So, okay, so there'll be job losses in those places because I have to say electric cars have a lot less components. So engines don't need to be made. A lot of things don't need to be made. Everything to do with fluids essentially almost disappears. Still using powers, but you don't use coolant, you don't use a lot of things you don't use. Now, the car is getting cheaper, the electric car is getting cheaper than the conventional car. So that means each time a car is bought, let's say it's the same numbers of cars, we've good reason to think there's not a drastic number of cars you're going to be bought. It's not going to be massively different. So what happens is all this money, it doesn't need to be spent. So it's remaining somewhere. So that's either profits for the manufacturing industry, or it's as a result of lowering manufacturing costs, or it's job loss, or it's cheaper cars for the buyer. So whether it's industrialists spending the profits or whether it's individuals, households spending the income they haven't needed to spend on the car, it's got to go somewhere. So it's displacing activity from here into here. And so any capital-intensive transition seems to do that. It kills up a little bit of industry, moves it into the services. So you've got job creation because the money goes somewhere, unless it gets piled up into wealth piles, into somebody's estate, essentially, where maybe the money goes nowhere and no jobs are created in service.
What's the boom in public transport?
Sorry?
People are using less cars. Where's the boom in public transport?
No, I'm not saying less cars. They're switching to electric vehicles, so still the number of cars, the same number of cars. I mean, it could be public transport too, that's true. And I'm just using this as a kind of a comparison. If we switched all the petrol cars for electric cars, I mean, of course, we could go to public transport, but that's definitely, and it could be electric public transport, which by the way could have a similar impact, because if we replace all the buses by electric buses, it will have the same industrial effect upstream the value chains. That makes sense. Okay, and the converse picture is that there's job creation in the new sector, so green electricity, batteries, and new things that need to be manufactured for cars. All of that also. Okay, but then why is there winners and losers? And that sounds like everybody's winning, according to this. I'd say that's kind of a whole economy level, like whole value chain level, maybe value chains, are kind of international, across borders. Okay, let's get into weeds then. So I'm showing a bunch of countries in this study we did with the model in 2021. So GDP outcomes, and don't worry too much about the difference between the two scenarios. It's an assumption about what OPEC does in terms of production of oil, whether more oil is produced by OPEC or the rest of the world. It's not massively important. I would just focus on the order of these curves. So you can see some countries are losing against the baseline. By the way, baseline is a hypothetical scenario in which the EV transition is not happening and no decarbonization is happening. I think that's a very hypothetical baseline because in fact, a lot of it's already happening. But let's say baseline is a counterfactual in which there's a lot of fossil fuel consumption. Then the US and Canada are losing, and then Russia are losing massively because they are quite large fossil fuel producers. In the end, in the US, oil is a big engine, right? Whatever we say, of course, the US does a lot of manufacturing and a lot of other things, and financial services, but oil is big. And in Canada, Canada's not that diversified economically is, but oil is disproportionately large in the Canadian economy. So that's what's happening. Whereas, what about these countries here? You've got China and European countries, India, they're kind of moderately gaining here. And the global level is just a slight, tiny uptick. So the global level doesn't really see much difference. But some countries see a hump and some countries see a plunge. So here's the story. So low carbon investment brings spending forwards. It creates construction. It's got to be built, right? If we assume it's going to be built, then it employs people. But decline in fossil fuels, that's the opposite. So in some places where there's more to lose than to gain, then there'll be more loss economically than gains. I mean, it's really in a way that simple, right? Got less investment, less production, less jobs, and that then has repercussions across the economy, what we call the multiplier effect in economics, which is if your oil worker is not spending his wage in the local market, well, the people in the local market aren't receiving this income, so they're also suffering, and that goes further down the chain and further down the chain. So countries here can really take a plunge. Countries here can go up. Sorry?
That's what a just transition that the unions are pushing for. That's taking that oil worker and transitioning them into a green job. So the actual employee doesn't lose that income. So that's their income is still coming into the service, into the economy.
Yeah, except that in countries where industry is really, and that's the sad thing about the matter, which in countries where industry is really so concentrated into certain types of activities, petrochemicals, for instance, then there's not necessarily something to go to for a lot of people. There's like an excess of workers in a particular type of activity. It's not just a matter of training. In fact, it's just a matter that there might not actually be jobs at all. So it can be quite a lot of unemployment in certain regions. It's just a question in industrial concentration. And to think of OPEC countries, or think of well, Canada's a good example, I think, because the Midwest in Alberta, and I'm Canadian, by the way, the Midwest in Alberta, it's very, very concentrated in oil. And so there, I mean, what are you saying, that people should move out of Alberta and go live in Montreal or something like that? I think it's very difficult to think, politically, economically, and really what's happening. And then I should say, maybe one of the most important effects is the interaction of countries between them. So one country decarbonizing affects the economic outcomes of another country, and really massively. I mean, think of China not consuming oil. That's absolutely huge, enormous quantities never produced. And so that's the US never producing all of that, or the Middle East. And so enormous interactions between the countries. And there's a trade balance effect where countries might worsen their trade balance by not exporting the oil they thought they were going to be exporting, and other countries improving their trade balance because they are not importing. Okay, I don't want to dwell on that too much, but this structure of economies are going to change drastically, where some countries are going to lose industry a lot on the fossil fuel producer side, and some countries are going to gain a lot of industry on the fossil fuel on the importer side. And it's partly because those countries some countries have a lot of manufacturing opportunities that they can capture, China notably, but also they don't have a lot to lose, and it doesn't have the same effect in the economy, so it doesn't have the same depressing effect of loss of investment, loss of expenditure, and so on. And they just have a kind of nice, beautiful kind of sort of economy taking off. But one has to remember that it's almost as if you could almost imagine that these guys are exporting job losses to these guys. Right? So that's kind of a crude way of explaining it. Okay. Because I think time is not on my side. So I want to talk about this instability aspect. I think that's a different story that maybe less familiar to people. I don't know, maybe some of you might be aware that central banks have got together to start looking at financial risk, and good on us here. The Bank of England was the lead for that, and then Banque de France. And so what's that all about? There was Mark Carney talking about climate-related risk, climate Minsky moment. That's kind of an expression that started to exist. What's going on there? What's the relationship with the economics of the transition I was just talking about? I think that's important because this is where things are going. Potentially what we're saying is that there could be an accumulation of financial risk coming from both climate change and the transition itself. And that accumulation of risk could crystallize, as Mark Carney likes to say, into big losses that could threaten financial stability at the whole financial system level. Essentially, if you have too much risk accumulated in some nodes of the complex network of finance, that could spill out and do domino chains where a lot of other companies could, it's a 2008 scenario, right? It's the toxic asset kind of propagating like a disease across your system. Right, so that's the price of oil. Here, I was just going to say that it's kind of an interesting question. Should we expect there being more volatility in the rapid technological transition where economies change really rapidly? It's probably reasonable to think that as a complexity scientist. Well, what's the reason? Well, indeed, you can see there's a massive difference between before 2005 and after the financial crisis. You've got a change of attitudes in OPEC. Here, you've had a lot of Venezuela went under essentially in that period when OPEC decided to produce more, and the Venezuelan currency just went into hyperinflation. And then you've got COVID for a moment, we don't see it, but oil prices went negative, and after that shot back up, Ukraine war. I'm not going to say that Ukraine war has got anything to do with oil, but it also doesn't have, it does have a relationship. We can't say that it doesn't. And gas prices also, and then we've got, and after that, inflation, the cost of living crisis. I mean, and it seems to kind of accelerate how we're heading into more and more trouble. What is going on? I think, and this is from a paper we put into the IMF working papers. The IMF being the kind of the world's central bank, as it were, likes this kind of discussion because they are, in principle, notionally in charge of maintaining price stability worldwide. Our proposal is to say that things could go unstable in what we call the mid-transition period, which is that period of the transition where things are changing fastest. Right? When things are changing fast, there could be instabilities. For example, in the oil market, because there's a rapid change in consumption of oil, there could be both oversupply or undersupply. So it could be that there's too much oil around because consumers are not consuming what they were supposed to, or there's just not enough investment in the oil sector and we're still consuming oil because we're decarbonizing quickly, but the investment went down quicker. And then there could be undersupply, which means the price could both go up or down. In fact, it could well go into an alternation of up and down. And so you can imagine that the oil market, which is central to the global economy, could really go into this roller coaster. And I think this is dangerous. There's the issue of stranded assets where value invested in oil could become stranded and cause problems of financial stability. This is a piece we had published back in 2021, but we had done work back in 2018 on this, calculating the value of oil assets worldwide. And with the transition, as we kind of see it occurring in the data, how much money could be lost on the balance sheets of different companies, and putting numbers on that. I should say it's not contingent on assuming that the world goes 1.5 degrees, because this 7 trillion here is only just China and the EU adopting electric vehicles, following the trend in the data. So it's really just a trend. And now that we've got data on the tipping point, I think it's even stronger, makes an even stronger case to say that this kind of money could really. So essentially what's happening is we're investing too much in green and brown at the same time, and eventually one of them is going to lose the battle, right? I mean, it's just, you don't need two energy systems simultaneously. So I think that's a thing to watch out for. that was part of the discussions of financial stability that went with central banks, and in fact, the Bank of England was often quoting this. We had, sorry, I'm going quickly, but we had looked into who owns those risks by looking at who owns the oil fields, who owns the companies who own the oil fields, and who owns them, and then at the ultimate level, you get into funds, pension funds, individuals, states, nations, and we find that in the US, UK, it's pension funds that own all of that risk. So it's your pension in the USS, for instance, whereas in developing countries, it's more countries, the state, like Pemex, the oil, the state-owned oil company in Mexico. Yeah, I was going to, I'm sure I'm going to run out of time, so.
5 minutes.
Okay, I wanted to make some comments about measures of stability in systems. So one thing I got into, and I'll talk about it quickly, I suppose, is measuring tails. Here, for example, you've got a time series of cost of shipping before 2002 and after 2002. There's a change in the thickness of the tail. You can measure that. It's very easy, and with the slope of that tail. And although it's very inaccurate, I think this number tells us something about how much tension there is in the system. So I think in the system that you stretch, the more you stretch it, the more fluctuations there will be in that system as you stretch it. So if we lack capacity in, let's say, this is logistics in this case, think of the trains in the UK where there's more and more longer and longer delays because there's lack of capacity against demand. It follows a straight line like that. So in the book, we've done a long study of this for various time series, including this is the S&P 500 index of. So that's the essentially financial value of the 500 most valuable companies in the world, and the slope of this tail is increasing slowly. Sorry, it's going towards 2 gradually, which says something about rigidity kind of emerging in the financial system. So why did we do that? I think the question is, with the transition increasing tension in the financial system, how much resilience do we actually have to go through with the transition? Would devaluation of fossil fuels lead to a 2008 type scenario of devaluation, or would we be able to kind of absorb that and move, get on with it? I think nobody knows the answer. I think that this is kind of where a lot of research should be going in looking at what is a definition for economic resilience, which is kind of the model here. So you can imagine a system could be stable, it could be unstable, on the edge of instability, and well, let's say here's chaotic. Okay, and I use some of the language from self-organized criticality and complexity science just to say that when you're stretching that elastic band, you're moving that way, and you see more and more fluctuations and tail fluctuations occurring. And when you get to here, that the elastic band snaps and then this breaks. I would say this might be what the world would look like with intense climate impacts, kind of destroying the economy more than it's able to rebuild itself. Whereas here, this is the economy we had, let's say, post-war, which was very kind of smooth and stable. Interestingly, is as demand increases in the economy, you're moving that way. And as you invest in capacity, you're sort of moving that way, where you're creating capacity, so you're going away from fluctuations. So as you improve the economy, you're going away from fluctuations, but as demand increases, you're going towards. And as we decarbonize, we increase the demand for a lot of industry and we increase demand for the financial system. It's capital intensive, so we're definitely moving that way. So the question is, do we see more and more instability in the economy as we decarbonize? I think that should be the question we're asking. Okay, I'll just skip to a critical issue here. I'll be concluding just after this. Yeah. Okay, so one example of the big risks I think not many people are aware of is that many countries could run out of foreign currency in the transition. So for instance, fossil fuel producers running out of US dollars, and that could make their currency plunge into hyperinflation. So you could think of Nigeria, you could think of Angola, lots of countries in Africa. I think that Colombia, Latin America, Algeria are all on the edge of a currency crisis as a kind of overhang of debt from COVID and a rapid change in oil markets. And all of that is conspiring to make these countries go right into trouble where they're going to have to be bailed out by the IMF. So to me, that's much more important than, say, the cost of the transition, because that would mean those countries would run into the ground essentially just like, well, Venezuela at the moment, and we've also got Lebanon in that situation. And interestingly is that the carbon tax option here, it doesn't help because it doesn't create US dollars. What helps is an investment from outside in US dollars. But this doesn't happen because nobody's got the confidence to invest in those countries because they're on the edge of a crisis. And if that happens, it's going to help nobody if a lot of countries head right into a currency crisis. And it could even do a domino effect where more and more countries head into that direction. I think a lot more study needs to go into this. Okay, I'll just conclude because I know I'm stretching it. Okay, so reflection on the transition. The transition is progressing rapidly. It's accelerating growth, but it's causing economic, financial, political risks. I think that's the key thing to remember, right? Winners and losers, trade effects. So what is a climate policy if I'm going to rethink climate policy, right? So it's much more addressing the risks than just putting a subsidy or a tax, right? So really using policy instruments that build confidence in the system, right? This is what has worked up to now. Role of carbon price, if any, to kill off fossil fuels. It doesn't really do much more than that. But killing fossil fuels doesn't bring green technology. Right? I think that's a really critical thing to think about. In the UK, we've killed coal with the carbon price floor, but it's the contract for difference that has created offshore wind, essentially. See it like that. We need a lot of policy making for financial regulation to manage financial stability or instability in the transition, right? We need investment just for expanding the economy, and we need critically to manage a decline because we're contemplating an economic decline in certain sectors. Of course, some sectors are taking off, but a lot of sectors are declining. And then what do we do with all the regions and people? And of course, there's the issue of currency crisis and debt sustainability. So that's my conclusion.
Yes. Any questions in the room?
Thank you. One of your data points was that the global debt to GDP ratio had changed from 200 to 220%. So what does that mean? What happens because of that?
Right, so think of 2008, let's say, and think of the financial network as a big network with certain points, and then you call this leverage, the amount of debt over existing value, let's say. So how much companies and banks are leveraging existing assets to create finance to invest in more stuff. So you've always got a stock of assets and liabilities. And if you've got a really high stock of assets and liabilities and they're very near to each other, you're on the edge of insolvency, right? So at that point, it takes only a small kick to fall over. Now, if there's a big network with a lot of nodes that are highly leveraged, one falling over can make the neighbor fall over because they may own each other's debt or equity in each other. And then if a lot of nodes are highly leveraged, that's where you end up like in 2008. This is exactly what happened is a domino chain of insolvencies propagating. Of course, there's going to be nodes leveraged like that. The global average debt doesn't necessarily matter because it depends on how it's distributed and if it's critical in certain areas or not. But it nonetheless says something. So if you look at debt to GDP ratio for countries, it does say something about their ability to withstand shocks, right? That's the key thing. If we're increasing debt to GDP ratio, then we're reducing economic resilience.
Okay, thank you. So where is the UK on that sort of metric?
So each country has a different, the threshold is not known for what is dangerous, right? I mean, that's big kind of political debate that led to austerity in Europe and so on. It's really kind of a difficult topic. The UK has an enormous debt, but it's also the world's financial system. So it's quite complex, the UK, because a lot of money comes in and comes out. And so essentially London's a big bank. So liquidity is enormous in the UK. But the UK also has some debt, but it's nothing like some of the developing countries where, in effect, a lot of countries are just right on the edge of insolvency. The UK is not anywhere near insolvency.
Thank you.
Despite what the newspapers might make you think.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask the question that's online,
Yeah.
and then Sharon and Peter. Michael's asking, is there a contradiction that Norway's EV boom has been funded by high taxes and oil? How does it work out in the long term?
I don't think there's a contradiction. I suppose that Norway has a lot of oil in the sovereign wealth fund, and has been saying it would use some of that to fund the transition. I don't know. I think it's definitely for oil producers, the thing to do is to use that wealth to transition and then end oil extraction at the time when. I have to say, I'm not proponent of telling oil producers to stop producing, because if we have insufficient supplies of oil, then we're going to end up into price instability. So it's the demand that is declining and then inducing the producers to stop. But that's a complex discussion, I suppose.
Sharon?
Oh, thank you for the talk, but it does strike me that we're, as a world, depending on large international corporations, and the macroeconomics of the world is that there's very few really big players that have a massive effect on this. And we're not very altruistic to other people. So we're not going to share our ability to take the company out somewhere else in the world that doesn't impact on us. It's an almost impossible position to go. How do you see, with the system that we've got at the moment, which is very, very highly capitalist, how do you see that we're ever going to sort of get to a point where we get past that sort of mid-phase? I mean, I just look at the effect of coal, for example, where in the UK, coal production has just almost completely disappeared. And absolute devastation there is in Wales and up north, where entire communities have gone. What you're describing would happen to a hugely greater extent if we make a very sudden transition.
Yeah, just the right analogy. Yeah, the same. I mean, you can think of oil producers as facing the future that the north of England has
Yes.
and Wales and Scotland have gone through. And of course, it depends on the policy, as you know very well, how that's handled. And that's my point on managing the decline is precisely this, right? So, oil and gas is currently high wages, high income industries concentrated in certain places. When that goes, it's going to be a disaster in those places. It's going to be industrial decline, and then what comes after post-industrial decline, the difficulties you have with communities living in those places. coal is a precursor. So coal decline is happening everywhere. It's happening in South Africa, for
Yes.
instance, it's happening in China. It's leaving those communities behind to some extent. And then there's all this discussion about the just transition and the just transition partnership. I was at the World Bank. There were loans being issued for South Africa to manage the decline in the coal regions. And it's very political as well, and all of this employment. I mean, yeah, so I think this is the question. This is the biggest question that needs to be answered, is how do we handle this? Because of course, if we don't, then we end up into populist politics.
Well, that's exactly what we've ended up in the States.
Exactly, and why it's so, it's so polarized in the US is precisely for that question, and I think that it was until we figured out what to do with that.
Type one more, so thanks, Jeff. I was very taken with the stuff you were doing on the tails of the variability. I think you were showing that it was increasing instability during the transition. But you also showed stuff about tipping points where the same thing's really being used to work out, you know, the tipping point's coming, it's the lack of resilience of the current state. So I was just wondering whether they were related. I mean, it felt like they ought to be, but you might expect when you're going through a transition or a tipping point that the existing state becomes unstable and you will therefore get fluctuations. So the sort of instability you're talking about seems to be consistent with both of those measures.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's completely related. We want some of the tipping points and we don't want some of the others.
It's also like, go ahead, sorry.
A financial crisis, I think you might be able to forecast. Well, some people have studied forecasting financial crisis out of the early warning signals approach.
Yeah, and it just reminds me of the down geological oscillations, you know, that happen between the glacier and the interglacier, but not either end. So you have two stable states, and during the transition, you get all sorts of fluctuations between them. Seems like a generic thing.
Well, yeah, and the kind of qualitative picture I showed about instability occurring in the mid-transition, I think that's something we need to think about, because I think it's intuitively think it's pretty much inevitable that there should be some instabilities when we're rapidly transitioning from one way of doing things to another way. And there's plenty of historical precedent to say that in economic history, where instability happened in those transitions between one type of industry and another in the industrial revolutions. All sorts of things can happen, and it could really be drastic or it could be managed, I think. But I think there's nowhere near enough knowledge on this.
Thank you.
All right, we're out of time, so I see no immediate pressing questions. So let's thank JF again for this. And I hope that many of you will stick around for tea, coffee, biscuits, everything, conversation, new ideas, new collaborations. And if you're online, I really encourage you to consider coming in person, because it really makes a big difference to what we all get out of these seminars, because the whole spirit of the GSI is to meet each other and make new connections across disciplines, across departments and buildings, and it's just great to all be together. So I hope to see many of you in person soon.
Can I just add something, which is, if anybody's interested in these tales that I didn't really have lots of time to. There was somebody dropped out of the tipping points series, and then he asked me to fill in. So it's completely by accident that in 2 weeks' time, I'm talking about these tales in the seminar series. I think there's want to know about this.
So yeah, part 2 in 2 weeks' time.